The Haunting Tales of Dark Shivering.
Dark Shivering is a quaint village which lies on the English and Welsh border. It is notoriously difficult to find, and with neither Wales or England staking their claim over it, it has been largely forgotten and untouched by outside hands. I stayed in Dark Shivering mainly in the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s on business. From the locals I collected many ghost stories. Here are a few of them to make you shiver. The Old Colour Works Factory. The Colour Works Factory sits just behind a row of 1920s council houses, their 50-foot gardens stretch down to its 7-foot-high wall which runs the whole perimeter of its 5,000 square meters. The factory has been there since the late 1800s and was a paint shop up until its closure in the 1950s. It employed over 50 local men and more from surrounding areas, so its closure was felt by the families in the village as this forced them to look for work further away from home. The large site not only houses the main factory, but also many smaller buildings. Mostly single-story storage facilities. The land and buildings have been for sale since the 1950s, but as it cannot be used to build residential buildings on due to undermining, it has remained a derelict plot. The villagers of Dark Shivering have embraced the factory as part of their landscape. Its worn but still charming multicolored Colour Works sign still hangs proudly above its flaking painted doors and rusted entry gates. Surprisingly, the signs have fared well over the years, and even though the colors would have been much bolder in their heyday, the now pastel lettering is still readable through the age of time. I passed the Colour Works factory every time I stayed in Dark Shivering. I never knew much about it, but the factory was an impressive sight to behold. It had the look of an old-fashioned hospital about it. It had a large clock in the center of the building above the main doors, but sadly its hands were long turned to dust. It boasted a mansard roof filled with windows along its edges. It was very ornamental in its construction and betrayed in all its features that it was once a paint factory. It wasn't until I happened upon chatting to an old retired security guard who had worked at the site, that I found out the old factory had a few ghost stories of its own. We had met in the gardens of the Dark Shivering Inn. It was a lovely warm summer's evening and we were both enjoying the late sunshine with an after-dinner cognac. Ron, the security guard, shared with me the following tale. I was working for a security company back in the 1960s. They had many different sites to keep secure and the Colour Works factory was a new job for us. Our company's main source of work was old industrial sites, ones which were no longer in use, but still owned by various companies, and they had value to the land. As guards we were used to working alone through the night. The buildings were empty and full of echoes, but you took it all in your stride. The Colour Works had been closed for many years at this point, but a large company from the city was using its outbuildings as a short-term storage solution. A guard was required at night from 6 p.m. and you wouldn't see anyone until 6 a.m. the next morning when the gaffer would arrive to open the storage buildings back up. It was a quiet job and there was never any trouble whilst I was there. The biggest problem for the security company was getting a guard to work there. Most only worked one night and refused to go back. I was probably one of the guards who lasted the longest. I worked 1 month exactly at the Colour Works before the company who were using it found alternative storage closer to their offices in the city. Our base for the evening shift was set up in one of the smaller buildings on the grounds. It was about 300 feet from the main building and was being hugged on all sides by brambles trailing up the walls. It was only 1 story and had just 2 small rooms, one being a toilet and the other was where we sat. There was an old desk in the corner with a fireside wing-back chair behind it. In the opposite corner was a heater which took the edge off the chill in the night. As part of our nightly duty we had to walk around the factory and site perimeter every hour, including inside the main factory. One of our gaffers would visit us once throughout the night shift to make sure everything was okay. Funnily enough, he visited the Color Works factory before dark just after 6 p.m. each time and never stayed long to chat. I had only started on the job a few days before the most unnerving things started to happen every night at the same time of 11:30. A dark figure of a man would walk past the office window. Now, the first couple of times this happened, I checked the whole area, but found nothing, and the next few times it happened I tried to get a good look at him. Each time he came past my window he would scare me, as he would catch me off guard. So one night I pressed my face right up to the glass for a good look, and when I saw him I wish I hadn't. He came gliding by as usual, but this time I could see he was in a soldier's uniform. He only looked like a young man, and to my surprise and terror, as he passed the window he turned his head and stared straight at me. The only thing was, he didn't have any eyes in his sockets. Just black empty holes on a ghastly white face. Well, I fell back onto the desk and didn't move for what seemed like forever. After each visit from the soldier, the office would go bitterly cold and stayed that way for a couple of hours. At this point I knew the place was obviously haunted, but I needed the job, and to be honest I didn't think anyone would believe me. From that night on I never looked at that man again, and even put up some makeshift curtains lest he should come up to the window looking for me. The ghost of a soldier wasn't the only problem with the place, and to be honest, as soon as I arrived there for my very first shift I felt a weird feeling from the factory itself. I do wonder whether the apparition was really a soldier or something darker trying to purposely scare me. It felt like you were being watched from the windows as you walked around outside. Sometimes it seemed as though shadows flitted across those black empty windows. I don't know why the factory had a bad feeling to it. As far as I'm aware, there were no tragic accidents and no one ever died there. The strange thing was, that one night you could walk around the whole site and feel perfectly fine. There was surprisingly little graffiti on the walls, the odd upside-down cross and pentagram here and there that teenagers had probably sprayed to amuse each other. But on other nights you had to push yourself to move through the corridors and brace yourself when you opened each internal door, almost waiting for someone to jump out on you from the other side. Fear could literally freeze you to the spot. The factory was a large stone-built building, and on those nights when the atmosphere was bad, you could hear voices in the empty rooms. If you tried to listen to what was being said, they would stop. But if you kept walking through the building, there was a permanent conversation going on that you were not invited to. Sometimes you could hear footsteps following behind you, but no one was ever there. The voices and footsteps were almost as if they were trying to give you the creeps, knowing you were there alone and vulnerable. On my last night at the Color Works, my gaffer came in before dark as usual and thanked me for working there. He told me that he had difficulty in getting any of the other guards to work on that site, and if I hadn't have stayed he would have had to end the contract early. After a brief chat he left and I worked my last night. It wasn't a good night particularly. The dark figure had already walked past my window and had left my room icy cold. A chill went down my back and I thought I may as well go and do my security check. I was almost finished inside the factory when I heard what I thought sounded like an animal growling. It didn't sound like a dog, but more like a monster you would see in a scary film. It was loud and guttural and froze me to the spot with all my hairs tingling. I felt very certain at that moment that I must get out of there immediately, but I didn't want to run. I felt like whatever or whoever was in there would start chasing after me like a predator. It was like slowly backing away from a lion. I walked backwards all the way through the main reception room and bumped into the front door. As I awkwardly twisted my body to get the door open, I took my eyes off the room to look at what I was doing, and boom, as soon as I did that I felt something running towards me. I couldn't see anything, but in my head I knew there was something going to attack me. I slid through the gap in the door and slammed it hard behind me. As I shakily put the key in the lock and turned it, something banged into the door from inside. It was such an explosion of noise and power I thought the door was going to come off its hinges. I ran back over to my office and I stayed there for the rest of the night. It was still dark at 6 a.m. when other workmen arrived on site. I handed over the keys with relief and began my walk home, not before I had a last look over my shoulder, of course. And boy did I shudder as I looked at the small one-story building he'd been sat in all night, and saw a tired white face with two hollow black eyes staring back at me from the office window. The thought of him being in my office with me all night was too much for me, and I legged it home. After Ron shared his story with me, I took it upon myself to do a little digging into the history of the site to see if there were any occurrences that could account for the ghostly goings-on. I spoke to Homer Powell, who is a local historian, and he told me that Dark Shivering had lost its fair share of young men in both wars, and so seeing the ghost of a soldier may not be particularly out of place. More interestingly though, one young man by the name of Herbie Jones died a particularly nasty death when he was caught up under a German tank. His body was turned to pulp, forcing his eyes to pop out of their sockets as the tank rolled over his poor lifeless body. His fellow comrades never found his eyes, and he was returned home to Dark Shivering without them. He was buried up in what is now known as Devil's Church Graveyard alongside a few other fallen men. It would seem by the sad figure that Ron saw most nights at the Colorworks factory that maybe Herbie Jones cannot rest to this day, wandering the night searching for his eyes. I have no idea why he would choose the Colorworks factory. Maybe locals used to walk through there as a shortcut. All I do know is that I have a very reliable witness who saw him on many occasions, in fact too many for his own liking. Join me next time for more haunting tales of Dark Shivering. Don't forget to click like and subscribe to hear more creepy content and never miss an episode.